I have great respect for soft power. I have great respect for people-to-people connect. But eventually, if there isn't something more tangible, uh, things like this can be manipulated. Whereas good, strong economic trade ties goes down to the last person on ground and benefits them.
Welcome to The Gist. I'm Aishwarya, and today I have with me Rami Desai. She's a distinguished fellow at the India Foundation. She's also an author, an anthropologist, and a scholar who's been covering Northeast for quite a few years. She also covers current affairs in India and the neighborhood. So, welcome to the show, Rami. And before we begin, I just want to give some background about her. She has recently visited Myanmar, and that's also one topic we're going to touch on. So I'd like to begin with actually that about how your experience has been visiting Myanmar, visiting the field. What is the current, can you give us a sense of the situation, what is going on there?
Aishwarya, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm very happy to hear that you're interested in, the neighborhood in Myanmar and the Northeast. Myanmar, as you know right now, has been in a state of conflict, and it continues.
Correct.
We also know that there's been a massive earthquake recently.
Correct.
I was there during that time as well, and that has been a setback to the people of Myanmar, as
Right.
well as to right now the SSC, which is the government in Myanmar. Of course, we know that post the coup 4 years ago, there has been a certain amount of conflict between the ethnic armed organizations as well as between them and the Tatmadaw, the military in
Right.
Myanmar. There's been massive amount of fragmentation of not just the ethnic armed organizations, but also it's very difficult for a layman to ascertain who is on which side.
Correct.
A lot of ethnic armed organizations have come on board.
With the military.
With the military on board. They've joined the military's democratic process. The military has promised and assured on multiple occasions for elections to take place.
Which I believe are scheduled to be this year?
Not this year, end of January, next year.
Next year, okay.
Or February. Of course, that is what is the date that they were saying before the earthquake. With the earthquake being of the magnitude that it is, we're not really quite sure if that will affect the elections, though I would say it wouldn't.
Okay.
And they would go ahead with the elections. Some political parties, there are 53 small political parties, so they'd be taking part in that.
Okay.
USDP being the major political party.
Right.
Ethnic armed organizations, there have been various armed organizations that have come on board
Right.
to partake in the process, but there are some very major groups that have not come on board. There's also then the National Unity Government, which is the government in exile, which considers itself well, hardly the opposition, but actually the government in exile.
Correct.
You asked me what is the sense on ground. This was just a snapshot of what's currently happening. But while I traveled in Myanmar, I traveled within the SAC controlled areas as well as the ethnic armed controlled areas. I think there is immense anxiety amongst the people throughout. It doesn't matter where you are.
You're saying this is because of the earthquake or because of the ongoing conflict that has been going on for far too long?
Of course, because of the conflict, and the earthquake hasn't made things easier for them. If you look at the fault line, it runs through Myanmar,
Correct.
the middle of Myanmar.
Correct.
And those are some of the most populated areas, Aishwarya.
Right.
If you look at Mandalay, you look at Yangon, you look at Naypyidaw, Yangon is the most populated area. So that's also been a setback to them, unfortunately. But the conflict, of course, when a country is in a situation like this, it is apparent that people on ground will have a certain amount of nervousness, anxiety. They don't know where the government process is going, what their future holds for them. However, I must also say this, usually in conflict areas we have an idea that when we walk in, there'll be bombings and there'll be military action. Yangon's not like that, Mandalay is not like that. Naypyidaw is not like that. It's relatively peaceful. People are going about their jobs. Domestic tourism has increased.
Okay.
There's been a huge amount of internally displaced persons from other areas who have moved into Yangon.
Yeah.
I think approximately 4 million.
Okay.
So there's been that sort of population increase as well. Real estate has gone up.
Right.
So, that's just a gist of what I saw.
Since we're on gist. I actually, since you've been talking about ethnic insurgent groups, that's actually a question I want to touch. What is the control sharing like with the military and the several rebel groups that Myanmar has?
See, it keeps changing a little bit. It's not just stagnant. Some would say it's about 33%, some would say it's about 50%. 33% towards the side of the ethnic armed organizations.
Okay.
Some would say it's 50-50.
Okay.
But recently, it was only last week when some of the bigger groups had to withdraw from a major city called Lasho.
Right.
And that was with the supposed intervention of China. So there is this sort of change in territory that's happening. But when we say control, when we say territory, I always then counter question, what do we mean by control? Are we looking at who controls what in terms of just the geographical area or administrative area or the population? Because if you were to look at it population-wise, SAC has
The
maximum population in their control. The territories under the ethnic armed organizations are very sparsely populated. Over and above that, there's been a huge amount of migration as well. If we look at administratively, again, a lot of the electricity, a lot of the gas supplies come from the SAC.
Right.
So it depends how we look at control. Territory, of course, whether it's 33%, whether it's 50%, it doesn't matter. That's a large territory in terms of a geographical area to be under control.
So, since you've mentioned this, I want to understand what are the differences in what were the distinct things that were different in areas that were controlled or governed by the SAC and those that were probably run by rebel groups?
Look, obviously you can fly into Yangon. You can go by local transportation. I tried to use as much local transportation as possible, whether it was buses, whether it was cars, whether it was local transportation within the city, throughout the SAC controlled areas. So that is possible in these areas. However, when from these areas I tried to go into some of the slightly more troubled areas, it would really be dependent on how the day was, in terms of whether there was fighting, whether fighting broke out. Like one of the places I had to go to, fighting broke out that day, so I couldn't.
But is the possibility of a fight breaking out more in a rebel-led area than the SAC? Like, is that something that you would say is a distinction factor?
I think that is true, because it's not just about the military trying to take back some of the space that has been taken, territory that has been taken by the ethnic armed organizations, but we also must understand that the ethnic armed organizations are not under one umbrella group. There are many of them, there are multiple of them. They have their own areas of control. There is multiple points of tax collection on highways. Most of the airports are still controlled by the SAC, by the military. But apart from that, if you go into the interiors, you never know what you might encounter. So that is a major difference. If I was to put this very simply and very candidly, I would say that I could travel in the SAC controlled areas with some amount of sense of safety. I could not travel into any of the ethnic armed organization controlled areas with the same. I probably could not enter, with the same amount of confidence that I could enter Yangon. But the other flip side, of course, is that people are people. You know, whether you're in Yangon or you're in any of the other peripheral areas, everybody is affected the same way. Prices have gone up. It's become more expensive. Basic necessities have become more expensive in this side and in that side. Obviously, international tourism has been impacted on both sides. There is a deficit of trust of the international, other major players around the neighborhood within Myanmar. You know, nobody knows where it's going, what the future looks like, if elections will happen or not. There's still that question, even though assurances have been given that elections will happen. There is a question mark on the political stability, because the question arises then is that major parties like NLD are not going to be a part of the election process. So there are all these question marks, and that then impacts Myanmar across, irrespective of who controls it.
So does the ceasefire that has also now been extended till the end of this month, does that help, or does that give some sort of relief, if I may ask?
Look, of course, any sort of ceasefire gives relief, but the ceasefire has not come because there has been any political consensus. The ceasefire has happened
due to a natural calamity.
It's because of a calamity, and either or of the groups would not look very good if they continued fighting. So this is more perception management. But of course, let's give them benefit of doubt to say that, there is genuine concern for the suffering of the people, because this was not just a normal earthquake. I mean, we've seen roads split open, we've seen buildings fall down like like a stack of cards. We've seen over 5,000 people dead, and there are sure more to come. So, of course, I think the ceasefire is a good thing, but it's not because there's a political consensus.
And if we're talking about insurgent groups, who are the key players?
Look, I mentioned NUG earlier on. So NUG was technically the umbrella group, which was to bring together a lot of the EOs. So they have some EOs that are under their control, but I think the major players would be Rakhayan Army, very pertinent to India as well, because territorial control-wise, they have the most amount of territory. They were a small insurgent group that only a few years ago cropped up. In the sense that, militarized themselves. People didn't think that they would be so sophisticated in their approach. And when I mean sophisticated, it's not just the military approach, but also the political approach of negotiations. They're very sophisticated in that sense. They also are somewhat of a mothership to some of the other ethnic armed organizations, providing tactical support. They were also a part of the China-backed Three Brotherhood Alliance, which is the alliance that was launched in the northern region. And mind you, that region is not next to Rakhayan state. Yet they had the ability to have over 15,000 soldiers there. So that gives you a sense of what their outreach is. Of course, then there's MNDA, there's KIA. There are many groups like this. Everybody has their own strongholds. Everybody has certain territories with either natural resources or geographically, very important places that they control, because that's why they would control it. There is also the sense of huge amount of illegal activities, whether it's the cyber scam centers that we've heard of recently, whether it's the drugs. We know Myanmar has become the single largest producer of drugs in the world.
So I will definitely come to the drug aspect. That's something I want to discuss. But before we move towards that, I just want to check, what do you think is the situation? How do you assess the situation in the Rakhayan state, and also how their economy has taken over most of the states, but they've taken off some parts are not in their control. We're talking about Sitwe.
Look, the only parts, there are 3 townships that are not in their control. Sitwe, Chopshu, and one more town. These are very strategic towns because Sitwe, obviously, as you know, India has stakeholding there, and Chopshu, China has stakeholdings there. But also remember that these townships are, they have their back to the sea. What the ethnic armed organizations don't have is they don't have naval power, they don't have air power.
Right.
So there's always this worry of the Myanmar Navy being able to counter them on that part. But more importantly, I think it's important to question why, if they've taken not just all of Rakhayan state, also spilled over to Chin state in Paletwa, why is it that they haven't taken these towns? It couldn't be just because of fear of this or that, because I think they faced enough fears throughout this experience that they've had in the last 4 years. And this is my assessment entirely. I think my assessment would say that they're holding on to it because there have been some negotiations. For example, with China on the Chopshu port, there's been negotiations of keeping it safe. These are assets that belong to China, who've spent a
So
huge
negotiations between the army, Arakan army? No.
Yes, the
Arakan army and the Chinese.
So they've had negotiations. They've resumed, cut a deal and resumed construction on the port. They've got construction workers there, managed to get them there, with the promise that Arakan would provide them security. I think this is also a longer plan for them, maybe to hold on to these places to be able to negotiate with the SAC in terms of some sort of revenue sharing. Again, like I said, this is my assessment. It's not something that they're saying out aloud, but it defies any sort of logic that if a powerful armed organization like AA can take up this territory, spill over to another state, also have skirmishes across into Bangladesh, why would they leave these 3 townships?
So what is your understanding of China's economic footprint in Myanmar?
Of course, China has a huge economic footprint like it has in a lot of places. China works very quickly. Also, we must remember that China has, over a period of time, gained leverage with not just the ethnic armed organizations, but also with the SAC. So they can influence MNDA, they can influence a bunch of these organizations, including A to a certain extent. But then they can also influence the SAC. And all of this comes about not because they're very well liked in Myanmar. The Chinese are not liked in Myanmar. The Myanmaris, they're very laid back. They're very gentle people. For them, maybe the Chinese are very transactional. They find the Indians, the Nepalese, a lot more culturally similar to them. Also, we've had a substantial proportion of Indians and the Nepalese who have settled there, generations ago, and have managed to integrate themselves into the Burmese society really easily. Which doesn't happen necessarily with the Chinese. So it's not because they're liked on the ground, we must remember that. It's because they have a different way of negotiating. It's because they're very quick in decision taking. It's because over a period of years they've been making strategic infrastructure. They've been making roads. We know of the autonomous district called Wa. And in the Wa region, it is the electricity, the Chinese supply the electricity, the education comes from the Chinese. So in these border areas, they've strategically created influence. We must also remember that groups like MNDA, their leadership never got along with the present senior general. It was the present senior general that pushed them back, and they took refuge in China. And when they came back from China, it was on the behest of the Chinese when the Three Brotherhood Alliance was activated. It was on the behest of the Chinese to counter some of the illegal activities that was going on the China-Myanmar border. And that tells us, without any doubt, of the kind of influence that the Chinese can assert. They also have a special envoy for Myanmar. And the envoy has full freedom to speak to, travel, negotiate with the ethnic armed organizations or with the SSC.
Where does India stand on this?
See, India's never
What is India's Myanmar policy?
See, India's never, India's foreign policy has never been based on any sort of interference in internal politics and matters of sovereign countries. There's never been that sort of interference before, and India has always had great relations with the people of Myanmar. Even if you go today, and all the stakeholders that I met, they kept saying, of course, some people felt that India could do more to bring in democracy and so on and so forth. But generally, everybody felt that, look, we prefer you to the Chinese, but because you don't have the kind of economic footprint here, we find.
Is it because we don't have the economic footprint?
Yeah, you see,
it would be hard to be involved without having some economic footprint, I assume.
See, if you go to Mandalay, you go to Pulin, these were largely Indian-dominated areas. If you go there today, you'll see a shift. Most of the places you go to, whether it's a hotel, whether it's a conference hall, any sort of public place, you'll see stacks of China daily. Right. And I was very intrigued by that. I said, why are you buying China daily? And they said, we're not buying it. There's a guy who comes and drops it every morning. So there is this sort of extension of influence, but also because of the kind of roads that they've made, so on and so forth, there is a lot of, there was a time when local things that you'd find in the supermarkets were India made. Now they're China made. It's obviously also competitively priced, right? But if you look at even cars, you see a lot of the Chinese cars there. But if you look at the illegal economy also, Aishwarya, which is something in a country like Myanmar you cannot ignore. These are Chinese syndicates that are controlling them. Now, if I was to talk about the cyber scam centers.
Correct.
This is an economy, a huge economy within itself. We are talking about what is now popularly stated as the single most important and the largest human trafficking event in history. At any given point of time, there are 200,000 people in these camps. And these camps are not just like, they're not just like sheds. Correct. They're like well-guarded, fortified, little township buildings which have their own supermarkets, they have their own bars, they have their own clubs. A lot of people there are held without consent. A lot of them have gotten used to it. A lot of them knew why they were going there. It's a mixed bag of people.
So this trafficking is only Indian citizens?
No. I had the opportunity to actually meet some boys who were escaping, and they happen to be Indians. And of course, we know by general news also that there are all sorts of nationalities there. But they were telling me, for example, there was somebody from Nigeria who believed that he was coming to Thailand to be a football coach. So it's a mixed bag. But the reason I say this is that you cannot look at economy in terms of China's influence as overboard economy. There's a lot of underground economy, including the drugs as well. These are run by Chinese syndicates. They give employment to thousands. There's heavy involvement of locals in terms of poppy cultivation, so on and so forth. So, yeah, China has an influence. They have their ambitions of the oil and gas pipelines. They have the deep sea port. So yes, undoubtedly they have.
I'm actually intrigued with the part about China being behind the main drug cultivation that you mentioned. Do you think it's also because of the porous Indo-Myanmar border that we're being affected with this problem?
Think it's like a business. It's like a chain. So I don't think China is involved in the cultivation per se. When Taliban shut down poppy cultivation to gain international legitimacy in Afghanistan, a lot of that cultivation moved to Myanmar. Now, obviously, people were poor. They were looking for another means of some sort of alternate income, and poppy cultivation combined with drip irrigation, which is advanced methods of irrigation, created a yield that was 4 times what they used to have before.
Okay.
Also, the quality improved. Therefore, obviously, it impacted the price.
Right.
This became rampant, and there has been Myanmar, they say, is now the largest producer of poppy. Now, the derivatives of that, creates, you have a lot of derivatives from poppy. You have synthetic drugs that are floating around. You have processing units in China. You have Chinese syndicates controlling, this chain of supply chain of the drugs. So that becomes a huge economy. Now, UNODC report says that, and let me tell you, UNODC only takes 10% of what is caught.
Okay.
Right, as an estimate of what's
Okay.
happening. And they estimate it to be a $40 billion business.
Okay.
But now you calculate it. There was recently a haul in Andamans, and that was, they estimate, over $1 billion just in Andamans, the largest that was ever caught. This has always been a problem with Myanmar. It's nothing new.
But so is India the primary victim, if I can say, or is it also other neighboring nations that are suffering or being affected?
Every nation will suffer. It's not just about India. Bangladesh, the kind of yaba pills that were going into Bangladesh, they had to take some really strict action and enact certain laws for the traffickers, because they wanted to counter the drug menace that they had. Now, what they were encountering was the yaba pill. The yaba pill is a drug from the 70s. So, like I'm saying, this is not a new business in Myanmar. Of course, the proliferation of it is now new, like the quantity that they're making, the kind of supply chains that they have. We've seen yaba pills being found in Japan, in Australia, in America, in South America, let alone in India and Bangladesh. So it's all over the world. So that is something that's new, but it's always been there to a lesser degree. Now, yaba pills are methamphetamine and codeine, and it keeps you awake for 4 straight days. Remember, there was a movie, what was it called? So there was a movie where this guy would take a pill and he would work on top speed for a couple of days.
Okay.
And everything was amplified. So yaba pill does that sort of work. So there were cases that people would not sleep, especially IT professionals, for 4 days because they had deadlines to meet. But the crash would be so bad. And finally, of course, it has the permanent impact that it does. It does the damage that it does. So Bangladesh was heavily affected, and the Rohingyas were being used as traffickers. So it was a double sort of edged sword for them. India, we've got some of the biggest hauls, and it's not just yaba pills. Yaba pills sell for $1 to $5 a pill. And $1 to $5 is what? It's nothing. In India, 400 rupees.
Probably one of the cheapest.
Yeah, one of the cheapest, So, and with our youth population, if it isn't a big menace already, it will become a big menace, because this is fertile ground for drug peddlers. You don't just have yaba pills, you have heroin. There was a time when states like Manipur had the highest rate of HIV, and it was through intravenous drug use. Now it's shifted to Mizoram. So, we of course will face the, we will face the after effects of this.
So I just want to sort of get to that. If this is one of the problems that India is also tackling, if it's also drug issue, but how if we are on the receiving end of some of these things, how can we engage with Myanmar? How can we be involved with them in a way that also helps us sort of keep these problems at bay?
So look, drugs is not the only problem. As Myanmar's conflict continues, which I believe it will, I don't think there are any easy solutions. There are no winners. The chaos will continue, election or not, no election. As this continues, there are going to be other problems of maybe famine, starvation, the economy falling apart. So we are going to have some amount of migration. We are going to have people who are going to come towards India, and our borders are porous. Our borders are unpluggable. Anybody who says that, oh, you should just plug the border has never seen the borders, because it's not possible to plug it. Yes, you can sure have an integrated system of surveillance.
Right.
You can have some areas that are walled. You can have some areas that are under surveillance. You can have some checkpoints. And I do believe you can have the FMR as well as surveillance go hand to hand. So you can have all of this. But again, here's the thing, and I always have said this, that the responsibility and the alertness of our border villages and the people who live on the borders is primary. Because at the end of the day, whether it's insurgency, whether it's drug traffickers, they need a route to come in. They need certain safe houses. They need, they need certain contact points. I am not, and this doesn't absolve the duties of our agencies. Of course, there's been a war on drugs that was declared in 2016. It was a meeting in Tripura that was headed by the Home Minister and all the chief ministers of the Northeast region, keeping this exact issue in mind. And therefore, if you track the amount of lots of drugs that we have caught in the recent past, you'll find that they are of historic proportions. Because there's been a determined effort to catch the traffickers. There's been a determined effort to block these routes. So I think while that is necessary and that has to be amped up in whatever way possible, I think there is something to be said about civil society responsibility as well. Because it impacts these villages first. It impacts these states first. So the routes that they're using are via Mizoram or Manipur.
Correct.
And therefore you see the kind of health crisis in these states. So I think that's not unachievable.
And what about beyond border crisis? What do you think can be India's involvement in the current Myanmar civil war and the instability that the country faces, when it's also about multiple factions running, technically multiple factions are running the country? So do you think India can have involvement, India can have relations with Myanmar, also be involved in some kind of peacemaking, and also if there's anything for India to benefit from its involvement in Myanmar?
Look, India is a great example of a really functioning, evolving constitution and a federal structure. And therefore, I think that's something that the people of Myanmar are very interested in. They've wanted a more federal structure. They've wanted a more active, active federalism.
Sans the autonomy or the monarchy that in some way that China has been displaying?
Sure, they've wanted certain amounts of autonomy as well, and it's not standard throughout the ethnic armed areas. Some groups want something, some groups want the other, which is what makes it terribly difficult. However, like I said at the outset, India's never interfered in internal politics of another country and doesn't expect other countries to do so with its own internal politics as well. But India has a lot of goodwill on ground. The people-to-people connect, as much as it's something that people don't give a lot of credit to, is huge on the ground. People don't see, people on the borders of this side and that side don't see each other as somebody different. They see it as a contiguous expansion of their own communities, which loosely they might be. But that is something I think we can really sort of establish, strengthen. We are never seen as a transactional community or a country to work with. I think, again, that's something that we can use to our advantage. And what we've done post the earthquake has given us a lot of benefits and blessings, because we have managed to provide, we were the first responders, and we've managed to provide humanitarian aid across. And I think that is something that has regained or at least reminded people of the goodwill that India has for the people of Burma. Apart from that, see, politics is going to take the shape that it is. Post the elections, I do believe that the SAC is going to regain its legitimacy, because there are going to be big powers across the world which are going to be compelled to pretty much accept the outcome of the elections. I think it would be important for the Myanmaris themselves to figure out solutions for themselves. I don't think anybody from the outside can find a solution for them. But on a more positive note, all is not lost. There's still trade between India and Burma, even though our borders, there are problems on our borders in terms of with the conflict in Myanmar. The pulse import from Myanmar has doubled. So I think this is how we can continue supporting. We can support the economy. We can, but again, see, Myanmar has to take the initiative. They have great coffee. I don't know why we don't have coffee from Burma in India. It would be a big hit. They have great food. They have great handicrafts. So there are things like this that they really can push as their industry, and India can be a very big buyer for it.
So you're saying trade ties can get stronger?
See, eventually economy is hugely important for strengthening ties. I have great respect for soft power. I have great respect for people-to-people connect. But eventually, if there isn't something more tangible, things like this can be manipulated. Whereas good, strong economic trade ties goes down to the last person on ground and benefits them. So I think that's something we need to strengthen. But I may be being very idealist here, because the roots, you have multiple stakeholders, therefore multiple illegal tax collection points, illegal, legal, however you look at it, making the cost of the goods go up.
Right.
So by the time they reach here, they're far more expensive than they used to be.
Right.
So these problems are there, we're aware of it, but I think chaos like this is not solved overnight. It will take some time, but the Burmese are very resilient people. They've never been a classical it's never been, how do I say this without getting myself into trouble? It's never been a classical democracy, so as to say.
Right.
So they've always found ways and means to adjust, and so they shall.
That's actually a lovely note to end this conversation on. Thank you so much for talking to us,
Not
Rami.
at all, Aishwarya.
Thank you, viewers, for being tuned in with us for this long a conversation. But I'm sure it was very interesting for you, as it was for me.
Thank you,
having a conversation with you. Thank you so much, Rami. Thank you so much for watching us on Gist. Please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.